Hi, I hope you're doing well. David and Noel are focusing on the book of Acts this month as Pentecost approaches. I thought it might be helpful to provide some context about the book of Acts. So what I've put together here is a fast-paced synopsis of Acts with maybe a few things you didn't realize were in there. So I suggest you grab your Bible, buckle in, and let's get started. First of all, Acts is Luke part 2. Imagine what it would be like if the book of Acts wasn't in the Bible. You get finished reading about Jesus' resurrection in John. Next, you read about a man named Paul who was writing to the followers of Jesus in Rome. Who was Paul? How did we get from Jerusalem to Rome? This book, written by Luke, answers these questions. Luke is writing both books to Theophilus. Who is that? Theophilus could have been a Christian wanting instruction, or perhaps it wasn't a person at all. The name could be symbolic since the name Theophilus means God lover. Or perhaps Theophilus is a Roman official being briefed by Luke about the history of the Christian movement. Some have wondered if these two books aren't actually defense briefs on Paul's behalf to give a Roman official background on Paul's case. Remember, by the end of this, Paul is in jail in Rome. So chapter 1. Jesus gives his final instructions and the disciples replace Judas with Matthias. And we never heard anything about Matthias again. But that doesn't mean he wasn't important in spreading the word about Jesus. In fact, after the first chapter of Acts, most of the disciples are never mentioned again. We have to assume that Matthias went about his business just like Andrew and Matthew and Thomas and the others did. Chapter 2 is Pentecost. They start praising God in different languages and are accused of being drunk. Peter, who is more well known up to this point for always saying the wrong thing, stands up and gives a sermon that causes 3,000 people to come to Jesus. That's a really successful first attempt. Chapter 3, Peter heals a crippled beggar. What I found interesting about this was the healing itself didn't cause anyone to be baptized, just like the speaking in tongues at Pentecost didn't either. In both cases, it was Peter's sermons that made people believers. The healing and the flashy languages are just what got people's attention. Chapter 4, Peter and John get put in jail and give their first defense to the rulers. These are the exact same people who plotted to have Jesus killed just a couple of months earlier. The rulers don't dispute Jesus' resurrection. They just want this thing to go away. But since they can't pin anything illegal on Peter and John, they let them go. An interesting thing to consider here would be the possibility that Saul was perhaps in the room for these interactions with Peter and John. Chapter 5, Ananias and Sapphira die. Not because they didn't give everything, but because they lied about giving everything. Contributions skyrocket. The apostles preach some more, they get put in jail. An angel releases them, they preach some more. They get put on trial, they get beaten, then released. They're happy. Chapters 6 and 7. Deacons are chosen to care for the day-to-day needs of the church. And we're introduced to Stephen, whose name is spelled correctly. Stephen is framed and arrested. For his defense, he recites the entire Old Testament. That infuriates the officials and they stone him. 3 interesting things happen here. 1. Stephen becomes the first martyr of the Christian church. 2. Unlike how these officials had Jesus executed, the execution of Stephen was done without regard to Roman law, but instead was carried out according to traditional Jewish custom. And 3. We're officially introduced to Saul. Chapter 8. Philip goes to Samaria, baptizes a sorcerer, and then he meets an important Ethiopian man who is reading the Bible but doesn't understand it. Philip tells him about Jesus and baptizes him. And to this day, the Coptic Christian church based in Egypt, Africa, and the Middle East trace their spiritual heritage back to this Ethiopian official. Chapter 9, Saul's conversion. Saul is on his way to Damascus to persecute Christians when he's confronted by Jesus. Saul is blinded. Saul is healed. Saul joins the people in Damascus that he was going to persecute. Jewish officials tried to have Saul killed, and his followers lowered him out of Damascus in a basket so he could get back to Jerusalem. Oh, and an added bonus in chapter 9, Peter raises a lady from the dead. Chapter 10, Peter has a vision about unclean animals. Peter has an encounter with unclean Gentiles, a centurion. And in that instant, Peter gets it. God has extended salvation to the Gentiles. Chapter 11, Peter has to defend himself to the other disciples. Chapter 12, Herod puts Peter in prison. An angel breaks him out of prison, and Herod is eaten by worms. Chapter 13, Barnabas and Saul set off on their first journey. And at this point, we're going to stop calling him Saul and start calling him Paul. No real reason given. We're just calling him Paul from now on. From here to the end, they're on the move. Paul with Barnabas, then Paul with Silas, then Timothy shows up and Paul performs surgery on Timothy. Paul has a vision about a man in Macedonia, so they set off for Macedonia, but they're thrown in jail again. While in jail, they sing and an earthquake loosens their shackles, but they stay long enough to lead the jailer to Christ. There's a lot of preaching in different places. In Troas, Paul preached for so long, a man fell asleep and fell 3 stories to his death. Don't worry, Paul brought him back. And then Paul kept on preaching for many more hours after that, making me wonder if that guy wasn't entirely happy he wasn't actually dead. Paul returns to Jerusalem where he's put in jail again. However, when they find out he's a Roman citizen, he gets caught up in 2 years of red tape in Caesarea and no one knows what to do with him. So he appeals to Caesar and is sent on a fast ship to Rome. That ship sinks. Then Paul is bitten by a snake. I mean, really, the luck of this guy. At last, Paul arrives in Rome and continues to preach for 2 years while under house arrest in Rome. And that's the story of how Jesus' ministry made it from Jerusalem to Rome. Lastly, I want to show on a map the 3 missionary trips that Paul took in Acts. Personally, when I look at maps in Bibles or back in Sunday school, I could never really make out where these maps were in relation to anything else. So I'm going to attempt to give you some context about where these places were that Paul traveled to. So using Google Earth, we're going to take off from the church here and we're going to fly to where the book of Acts was happening. So we're taking off. We're going to fly across the Atlantic Ocean. And you can see Africa. You can see Europe. We're going to zoom in. And this is the area where all of the missionary trips took place, out of Israel, Cyprus, towards Greece, and Macedonia. This is Paul's first missionary journey. They started in Antioch, which I've circled. They sailed to Cyprus, walked across Cyprus, and then sailed from Paphos up to Perga. And then from there, they head inland to Antioch. In Antioch, they were kicked out, so they moved on to Iconium. They faced a death threat in Iconium, so they went on to Lycaonia, where they healed a crippled man and the crowds thought they were Greek gods. So then they were stoned and left for dead. Then they moved on to Derbe, back to Perga, and sailed back to Antioch. This is Paul's second missionary journey. He started in Antioch and didn't sail. He went up to Cilicia, and then from there over to Derbe and Lystra. Timothy joined them as they moved towards Troas. That's where the guy fell out of the window. Then they go across to Macedonia, around through that area until eventually they get back to Ephesus, where he's begged to stay at Ephesus. He leaves Aquila and Priscilla there, sails back to Caesarea, reports in at Jerusalem, and then heads home to Antioch. This is Paul's third missionary journey. Again, leaves out of Antioch, goes overland towards Ephesus. He actually stays in Ephesus for 3 years before being kicked out of there. Goes up to Troas and then across to Macedonia, down to Corinth, where he spends a winter. He was going to sail directly back from Corinth to Jerusalem, but then realized that there was a plot to kill him, so he went back overland, eventually making his way back to Troas, getting a ship there, and you can see the stops he made on the coast, making his way to Tyre, and then to Jerusalem where he was arrested. This is Paul's journey to Rome. So he was under arrest in Jerusalem. He spent 2 years at Caesarea. Then he appealed to Caesar. They put him on a boat and it sailed around Cyprus to Myra, got on a grain ship, and that took him under Crete to Fair Havens. The captain of that boat didn't want to do the winter there, so he tried to get to Phoenix, but a storm blew them out to sea and they shipwrecked at Malta. They were rescued and then he eventually did make it to Rome. That's it. Thanks for spending this time with me. Now you go back and read the book of Acts for yourself, because there's a lot that I couldn't cover in 9 minutes.